Welcome to Planting Pinellas, the podcast that digs deep into the heart of gardening in Pinellas County, presented by Master Gardener volunteers of the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. I'm Charlotte Vaughn.
I'm Alan Shapiro. Whether you're a local looking to connect with your community or a visitor curious about your area's culture, conservation, and all things green, this is the place for you.
Join us as we explore the people, places, projects, and of course plants that make Pinellas a thriving hub of sustainability, innovation, and natural beauty. From gardening tips to environmental initiatives, we've got the roots of Pinellas covered. So grab your gardening gloves and let's get started. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Planting Pinellas. Alan is away this month, and in lieu of his normal participation, I have Dr. Joyce Fassbender, who is with the Xerces Society and Florida Gulf Coast University, the Department of Biological Sciences, just an overall fascinating person. And I had the opportunity to hear her speak recently in Largo and invited her to join us on the podcast. And she is dialed in with us today, all the way from South Florida. And welcome, Joyce.
Hi, Charlotte. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about insects and pollinators and how we can help those guys out.
I have to confess, I had the Reading Rainbow song running in my head this morning, butterfly in the sky, and just thinking about the beautiful pollinators that we have all around us. And yet there's a lot more to it than just the bees and the butterflies. So I really want to get into some of that. And I understand that a particular interest and focus of yours is insect conservation. And I love being able to take a positive spin on it, that yes, we understand that there are declines and threats and major concerns that we need to be dealing with. And yet you can think of it in this is how I'm helping out and this is how I'm supporting them, so that it doesn't feel unachievable, but that we can really just dive in and say, this is what I can do. So how would you approach the idea of insect conservation at a homeowner level? Because our audience is residential people in Pinellas County, and that includes some condos like high-rises and apartment buildings. And there's something that everybody could do, right?
Absolutely. So it's funny that you mentioned the butterflies and bees. Those are the pollinators that we actually know of most commonly, because they're the ones that are in your face and the ones that are all over our clothing and all over the bags that we carry. And, you just see them everywhere in the world. But there are a lot of other really cool pollinators out there that they're not really the pretty ones, if you will, or they actually fly at other times besides the times that we're outside. So, there's some that fly only when the mosquitoes are out. And I don't know about you, but if the mosquitoes are out, I'm not out. So these are things like moths. Moths are actually some of our most important pollinators. They are just as important, if not a little more important, than bees. There are beetles. Beetles are actually our first pollinators. They were the first pollinators to start to develop relationships with plants in the beginning when plants started developing flowers. But my favorite, because I like the creepy things, are the flies. So there are a lot of different types of flies that are pollinators. Even those green metallic green bottle flies, or blowflies if you call them that, are pollinators. And they are really important pollinators of the stinky things.
Right.
So if you come across a stinky flower, it's probably pollinated by a fly.
I remember growing up, we had beautiful ornamental cactus until this little balloon starts to form. And once that thing opens up, my goodness, you better have it outside, away from you.
Exactly. One of the biggest flowers in the world is a carrion flower. The flower itself is about 6 feet tall, but it's also called a corpse flower because it smells just like a dead body. So it attracts flies, it attracts ants, it attracts anything that would go to a dead and decaying animal. So sometimes home gardeners are discounted when it comes to conservation efforts. But when it comes to insects, home gardeners are a ridiculously important part of the process.
I would say positively and negatively.
Oh, exactly. But for an informed home gardener who is learning everything they can about supporting wildlife and about developing a more natural ecosystem in their home. Those types of home gardeners are very important to the process. And this doesn't mean that they can't necessarily grow those non-native plants that they love so much. It just means that they have to find a balance in there.
Yeah, and we know that the native plants are very important to our local ecosystem and especially our local insects and other wildlife. But like you can have a balance and you can have, let's say, a zone where right by your mailbox or right by your front door that you just want a certain look, and that's fine, and you maintain that look, but then find some other areas and plant some pesticide-free zones and things where you're not right up against a lawn that's dealing with certain kinds of fertilizers and things that are more likely to cause some concerns for those wildlife. Just things that you can do, whether it's on a small scale, even in some containers, patios for condominium dwellers and apartment dwellers, that even if you just have a small space or a small window area that you can plant something outside of your window, that there's things you can still do, right?
Absolutely. So there are some native plants that lend themselves very well to container gardening. A lot of our wildflowers, you can grow a lot of them in a small space, so they can be bunched in together. And if you have even just a large pot, you can put in 3 or 4 different types of native wildflowers, some that are tall, some that are short, some that are flat, some that have tubes. And these will actually attract bees, they'll attract butterflies, you'll find moths, you'll find all sorts of insects that are attracted to just that one container.
Yeah,
So
and you're
you
giving
can
different
still
options.
Exactly. And those different options can still provide nutrients to the insects in the area. And those insects feed birds and bats and all sorts of other animals besides just pollinating. So it is a really important part of just the overall ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I want to take a little detour here because I actually had a crisis this morning where I was running late for our appointment today because the power company needed to move my fence and move my herb garden. And I had a handful of carrots that I hadn't pulled yet. So I was scrambling to save the plants that I wanted to save before they had to completely tear that out to do some work. And on the carrot greens that I was pulling up, there were some beautiful black swallowtail caterpillars, and I had parsley and dill and some other things that they like to host on. But I did bring some of them indoors, and I just want to get your opinion on. I feel like this was a special case scenario where their home was being disrupted, so I needed to save them. But how do you feel about quote unquote saving the caterpillars or saving the butterflies versus just providing a natural space where they can do their natural things, which includes sometimes being eaten by birds?
So in emergency situations like yours, I 100% approve of bringing the caterpillars indoors, although not necessarily indoors, but maybe in an enclosed space like on a patio or near the house rather than in the house, somewhere where they can still experience nature and the temperature and the light change, because temperature and light change are both really important for insects that are going to go through metamorphosis, to go through their pupation and into adulthood.
Okay.
My concern comes in when people are unnecessarily taking those insects inside. Now, I understand the desire. I absolutely do. I've raised caterpillars. I love to raise caterpillars, but the problem is that, and I'm sorry to quote The Lion King, but there is a circle of life.
Right.
And within that, that means that there are a lot of animals that eat insects. So there will be caterpillars on your plants that will be eaten by other organisms. But this is feeding an ecosystem. It's not just saving one caterpillar.
And the thing is that it's actually beneficial either way. And that's hard to get your mind around
Exactly.
because you think about, oh, I just love butterflies. I don't want any of them to suffer and be eaten. Well, I love birds too. I don't want to lose them either. So that is a hurdle that we have to get over in our mentality of that if we're gardening for our ecosystem, it's the whole food web, and supporting that food web, that it really is the big picture. And so you will lose some caterpillars, you will lose some other pollinators, and yet you're still providing a home and a habitat where they can thrive. So then the populations of the butterflies and the birds can all be benefited by your gardening.
Exactly. So they actually did a study on Carolina chickadees, and they found that to raise just a single clutch of eggs, just one brood of eggs, it takes 10,000 caterpillars just to raise one brood of eggs to adulthood. So we have to accept that some of our caterpillars are going to be eaten, but also if you're providing homes for them, now if you have a container garden, you won't usually have caterpillars unless it's special circumstances. But if you have a larger garden, some of those caterpillars are going to survive. You may never see them survive, but you will see the results. You'll see the butterflies flying around. You'll see the moths flying around.
Right.
But this also feeds birds, and it feeds other animals in your garden. And we need to protect those too, because part of the reason why we need to protect the insects is because the insects are eaten by literally almost everything, at least at one stage in their life or another. And if we protect our pollinators, that means that the plants produce food for adult birds. They produce seeds, they produce fruits. This also helps out another layer of organisms besides just the birds, because it helps the bats, it helps other insects, it helps a wide variety of organisms in our ecosystem. So pollinators are important for all sorts of different levels of helping other animals and plants.
So let's talk a little bit about the doom and gloom side of it, because we understand that there is a crisis. And I know that there were some more recent studies published about the levels of decline that we're seeing in pollinators in general. What would you say is a major takeaway when it comes to the threats in our ecosystem and our environment, and things that are at a level where a homeowner could actually make a difference?
So there are a couple of things. So it depends on the pollinator, but overall, pollinators benefit from having habitat, from having those native plants that they need in order to feed their young, to feed themselves as adults. So native plants that have flowers, and also having host plants. But one of the biggest issues that we have, I hate to say it, it's the lawn. And I understand the beauty of a well-tended lawn. I really do. You get to run on that thing, your grandkids get to play on it, you get to have picnics out there. But one of the things I like to encourage people to think of when they think of their lawns is think of it more of an area rug than a carpet, because that's a lot of area that's not feeding anyone. And just some ground cover that mixes in with your lawn, if you can, works really well. There are at least 2 or 3 ground covers that you can easily mix in with your lawn that will keep it nice and lush and green, but occasionally pop up little flowers for pollinators.
Yeah, the
and
frog
some of
fruit.
them are even host plants for some. Right, frog fruit is exactly the one I was thinking of, and it is a host plant for the white peacock butterfly.
Yeah.
So it has that double benefit. Also, sunshine mimosa.
Mm-hmm.
It's also called sensitive plant. It has those little leaves that fold up if you touch them, which as a child, oh my goodness, it was the highlight of my summer to find one of those plants. I would just like keep touching it and it would fold up, and eventually my mother would be like, listen, you're going to hurt the plant, which of course then as a child I would cry and then go immediately back to doing it. They make these little pink puff balls, which are amazing. And if you've ever seen a bee on one of those puff balls, it is
Beautiful.
sublime, because the bees just like rub themselves all over it, and they're like, yes, this is the best thing I've ever done in my life. And so there's all sorts of layers of beauty just in this one plant, and it forms an amazing ground cover.
It really
It's
does.
very drought resistant, and being drought resistant, it really helps during dry season. And when the second rainy season comes, or there's just a little bit of water, it just fluffs back up. And there's so many beautiful ground covers that you could just mix in with your grass. You don't even have to let them take over. You can just mix them in with your grass, and They are soft to the foot if you want to walk barefoot, and they help with our pollinator problem.
I will say anecdotally that the areas of my yard where I've already replaced the grass with ground covers, that as we've gone through this drought over the last few months, those have stayed green, maybe varying shades or a more burgundy green, but they have stayed green where other sections where I still have grass growing have browned out completely. And I don't personally supplemental water my lawn. I don't feel like that's the right choice for me. So the fact that I didn't have to supplemental water those ground covers and they still looked nice.
Same for me. And actually, it's been the same in the lawn around me, because some of my ground cover has snuck out of my garden and into the lawn around me, but it's kept that area green and it hasn't required any extra water, and all the lawns around me are like brown and crunchy, and the lawn around me has been really very pretty. And then once the sunshine mimosa started blooming, there'd be like a little pop of pink and another little pop of pink everywhere, and it's just been beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, and there's some others that have yellow flowers and different types of flowers, or honestly, the frog fruit flowers are so small that they're barely noticeable. And if you don't like the look of the flowers, then you can just trim it with a high setting on your mower and it'll mostly just remove some of those flowers. But we do want the flowers for the pollinators. So the fact that you don't have to cut them and yet they are not so eye-catching if you don't want them to be. We talk a lot about what is your tolerance level, or maybe what is your partner's tolerance level or your HOA's tolerance level, that working within parameters that are real for you, that you do need to deal with,
Yeah.
you can still be very creative and you can still create a beneficial environment in whatever space you have. And again, whether that's one small container on a patio or whether it's a whole section of property in a neighborhood, and just growing that impact and influencing some people around you. That I love it when I see other homes in my neighborhood that are expanding kind of a plant bed area or wildlife friendly area and reducing the very needy lawn areas where they're having to run irrigation or they're having to do fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides, honestly, because they're so consumed with protecting the look of their turf that it does create a hazard for the beneficial pollinators and just insects in general.
So another great thing about frog fruit is that if it's continually mowed, the flowers will grow shorter. So they'll be the same height as the grass eventually.
Okay, that's good to know.
So they'll still bloom. They'll just be shorter. They'll be mixed within the grass instead of above it.
Yeah.
I love it when I start to see people around me switching to more native habitat. So I live in an area with a very permissive HOA. We have a fence around our patio, and then there is a 3-foot strip around our fence outside the fence that we're allowed to garden however we like.
Okay.
With the exception, nothing that attracts larger animals. So food plants are not really allowed.
Okay.
But I put in a pollinator garden. It was during 2020 when things were how they were, and I had a little time on my hands, so I put in a pollinator garden. And it bloomed and attracted so many butterflies that first year that people would come by, and it became essentially a neighborhood tourist attraction.
I love it.
Just so people could do something outside their houses. And my favorite comment was, I heard someone shout outside one day, "Look at all the butterflies." And I'm like, yes, success.
Yeah. I think there's a pendulum swing with that where people, when we weren't going out of our homes as much, we were really looking around and saying, I could do something here. And then we've started to shift back into a busier life. And yet people are really digging their heels in and saying, no, I don't want to go back to that busier life. Let's find some middle ground. And so the hobby gardening, I think, is thriving in exponential ways that we really are starting to see more of an influence for it. And I think that HOAs are taking note, and that, like you said, there can be some real concerns. My parents live in a very densely populated HOA, and they have some similar rules to what you described, where they're trying to avoid nuisance wildlife as far as the density of their population. And yet, there is some flexibility to how we can plant beyond that, and whether it's herbs or flowers, and they don't want fruits and stuff like that, but there's still a lot that
Right.
we can do. And supporting those pollinators and putting in some host plants, and especially the native plants, I think it's fun in that
Yeah.
community situation where when you have a native plant that is really thriving and successful in your area, that most of those are more like what we would consider an heirloom style plant, where they're true to seed and you can
Yeah.
save the seeds from them. So then if you want to share that plant, you can just rip off a dried up seed head and say, here, take this home and sprinkle it where you want it. And it's probably going to grow. And there's several plants that I have in my yard where I'll just walk around picking and spreading those seed heads, and it just continues to multiply and thrive. And if they get into a place where I didn't really want them, then I can move them out of that place to somewhere else and just keep that ecosystem thriving. And I think it's important to note here that there are some pollinators that are migratory, and we have the concerns about the OE and all of that, of making sure that you're not using a non-native milkweed that could harbor that virus in the times of the year where the monarchs are supposed to migrate anyway. And yet, in our region of Florida, not all of them do, whether it's monarchs or other pollinators. So I think that it's important to select things that will bloom as much of the year as possible. Are there some particular plants
Exactly.
and plant relationships that you can think about that would help with that in maybe some of the slow months?
So most of the plants that I can think of that bloom continuously or throughout the year are bushes. For example, the gray leaf tea bush is an
That's a good
amazing
one.
pollinator plant if you want to feed bees, because where I am, which is Fort Myers, it blooms all year round. But some other great ones, although this particular species, this particular plant, it's sort of iffy as to whether it's native anymore, because that's been happening a lot with some of our pollinator plants. The tropical sage,
Okay.
it blooms most of the year. Native porterweeds bloom a large percentage of the year, and most of them are actually somewhat cold tolerant. Not really freeze tolerant,
Sure.
but cold tolerant. They can handle close to cold temperatures.
Yeah, I will say
Those are,
one that's not native here, but it's what we would consider Florida friendly in the IFAS definitions, is the African blue basil plant. That has
oh
so
yeah,
much pollinator activity on it. And I will throw out a forward look to the Great Southeast Pollinator Census coming up later in, I want to say it's August or September, that I did a count on that plant, and it was about 10:15 in the morning. And the idea, for those that aren't familiar with that census, you pick a single plant and you've got a clipboard that gives you some guidelines of what to look for and how to identify it. And there's some training that you can take ahead of time to be better at identifying what you see. And then you set your timer for 15 minutes and you watch that one plant and you count each touch. And if an insect touches, flies, and touches again, then that can count as 2 touches. I could not keep up. I want to say it was over 200 touches that I identified in
oh
that
wow.
15 minutes, because as soon as I could look at something and mark it down, I was seeing another. It's just that plant hums. It is so full of pollinator life that you can hear it when you walk by. And I love that.
That's amazing. So the census is in the end of August, and it is a really great project to be part of. And anyone who's interested in that, they have a website. I highly recommend it, because it is a really good way to contribute to the science of our pollinators.
Yeah, I'll put that web link in the show notes so that people that are looking for that resource can easily find it here. Just for fun, I want to hear a few of your favorites as far as plants or specific pollinators or those factoids that you love to collect. And I will ask you one that our extension agent, Teresa, actually shared with me a couple of months ago. What would you consider as the largest pollinator?
So that depends on what you mean. Do you mean size or do you mean most efficient?
The biggest creature that is a pollinator.
That's a good question. I imagine that it's a vertebrate.
So
I mean, humans are pollinators. I don't know if that counts.
She actually said the giraffe is considered a pollinator of certain flowering trees and is therefore the biggest pollinating creature because it can reach up into the taller branches of these flowering trees. And the little fuzzy whiskers that it has all around its mouth and nose will then distribute pollen across the flowers. It is so cool. Just things that you would not even imagine.
I mean, I'm obviously geared towards the smaller things, being an entomologist, but that is amazing. That never even occurred to me, and that's awesome.
Yeah, that's definitely a fun fact to pull out every now and then. But what are some of your favorites?
There's so many. So I know I like to talk about bees a lot. So the most common insect used to represent the Save the Bees movement is the honeybee. The problem is that the honeybees don't actually need saving.
Yeah.
Honeybees are introduced, so they're not native to the United States. They were introduced for agricultural purposes.
They're actually classified as livestock.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. They're the closest we have to a domesticated insect. Honeybees actually produce way more honey than they need because we have bred them to do that. So honeybees are in some ways amazing because they do pollinate a lot of our crops. They pollinate alfalfa, they pollinate beans, they pollinate a lot of things, but they are problematic because they do have some diseases. They have mites that they can spread, they have some viruses that they can spread, and as I said, they're not native to the United States, plus they are not endangered. So I like numbers. I saw a report recently that said that there are around 3 million hives in the United States, and each of those hives has anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 bees in it.
Now, are you talking about those numbers are for honeybees or those are all bees?
Oh, that's just honeybees.
Yeah, okay.
So that doesn't include our native bees. That's just straight up honeybees. So honeybees aren't endangered. They're very well managed by humans. They do have some threats, but those threats are constantly being essentially taken care of and studied.
And when you say that they're spreading diseases, they're potentially spreading those to the ones that are endangered, right?
Right. So it's not super common, but it can potentially happen. The bigger issue is that with that many honeybees, they can crowd out the native bees.
Yeah.
So our native bees are very different. So we're very familiar with honeybees. They live in hives, they have a queen, they have workers, they're all ladies, except for the ones that are going to reproduce with the queens. So we know all of these lovely things about honeybees, but what most people don't realize about native bees is that most native bees are solitary.
Right.
The exception are bumblebees. Bumblebees form hives. They produce a little bit of honey, but not a lot. But most of the other native bees are solitary. They live by themselves. The males and females will get together to mate and then separate again. And so the only bee that's taking care of the young is the bee that laid those eggs.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason why our native bees are under threat is because if something happens to that female, then all of her eggs don't develop. They're not protected. They are not given enough food. They don't survive.
Now, do you recommend having those little bee houses and things that you can buy, or do you feel like that a lot of those don't adequately support the native bees that we have in the areas that they're used, or maybe even they're not maintained correctly to be beneficial versus potentially harmful to those bees?
If they're maintained well, and by maintained well, I mean after the young have emerged as adults, if they're cleaned, made sure that they're cleared of any sort of mites or fungi that could potentially grow on leftover mud or leaves, then they can be beneficial to some of our native bees. But the problem is that a large percentage of our native bees are actually ground dwelling. They don't live in the little cavities. So the little bee houses are great for mason bees. They're sometimes great for carpenter bees, but not super great. And they're great for things like leafcutter bees if they're well maintained. Cleaned yearly, made sure that anything that looks damaged or has fungus in it is replaced, protected from predators a bit, because some birds start to recognize those houses and will actually peck and pull out the larvae. But like I said, a large percentage of our native bees are ground-dwelling bees, so they don't actually use those bee houses.
What can you do for those?
For those, it's just a matter of leaving some space. Ground-dwelling bees generally live in areas where there's not like dry, bare soil, but like some simple, mostly bare soils. You'll find them a lot under things like oak trees and other types of trees that the grass is a little sparse. And you can tell that there are ground-dwelling bees there because they have what look like little ant nests. They have the little clods of dirt. But if you look closer and watch for a little bit, it's not going to be ants coming out. It's going to be little ground-dwelling bees.
Yeah.
And I might be biased, but I think the ground-dwelling bees are way cuter.
What are your favorites there?
I love me some ground-dwelling bees. I think my favorites are, what are they called? It's a species called Agapostemon splendens. It's also known as a brown wing sweat bee. They're the little metallic green ones with yellow and black striped abdomens.
Okay.
They have such cute little faces.
That's awesome.
But I mean, if you look at most bees have ridiculously cute little faces. Although, this year I've gotten 2 new species of bees in the garden, and one of them made me so excited I called my sister crying. I have leafcutter bees in the garden. So I've been growing the garden for like 5-6 years now. And I've seen all sorts of, an influx of all sorts of different species.
Mm-hmm.
So there are like little rabbits that live near the garden now and all sorts of different species of birds. There was a snake, don't tell anyone.
Hey, snakes are wildlife too.
A lot of people exactly. A lot of people don't like snakes, but I was very excited to see it because it meant that my ecosystem is developing. But this little leafcutter bee, I have been waiting for a leafcutter bee for years because they need enough support and they need the right types of support. So leafcutter bees generally prefer like flat flowers, although they will feed on little short fluted flowers. And so I've been trying to grow more plants that are bee friendly, and the leafcutter bees meant that it worked. And part of the reason why I love leafcutter bees is because they have little hairy bellies. So rather than collecting pollen on their legs, they collect pollen on their bellies, so their bellies will get bright yellow with pollen.
That's so cute.
I find that ridiculously adorable.
Yeah. I know that I have some roses that have reverted to more of an old-fashioned style, so they are more open and flat. And I see the characteristic circles out of the leaves on those. And so that's evidence, I'm sure, that there are leafcutter bees going on. And I have seen them on occasion.
Absolutely.
It's just so rewarding to see that. And I have to ask the question because I know that when people are hearing about pollinators and in particular bees, that there's always the concern of allergies. And some people have very severe life-threatening allergies. What would you say to those people in regard to gardening for wildlife in their personal space?
So if you put in flowers, it's impossible to avoid bees.
Yeah.
I will tell you that native bees generally either are stingless, they don't have the capability of stinging, or they will avoid you rather than try to sting you.
Yeah.
Because again, it's the one female and her eggs, and if she can't take care of her eggs, they die, so she's going to run away rather than fight.
Yeah, and I've found that to be true in my garden.
Part of the reason why honeybees are problematic is because people who are allergic or just afraid may freak out, and then they'll swat at the bee, and that freaks the bee out and makes her more likely to sting.
Sure.
I have actually reached into bushes covered with honeybees because I had to cut a branch or because there was something I had dropped on the ground and not been stung.
Yeah.
So the bees aren't trying to sting you. In fact, if a bee flies to you, that means you either smell really nice and like flowers, or you look like a flower. So it's kind of a compliment in a way.
I'll take that.
I will tell you this, though. There are perfumes coming out lately that attract bees. Banana perfumes in particular have been, I've been reading about people having problems with banana perfumes and bees. So if that bee is super interested in you, that means that it thinks you smell like a flower.
That is interesting. And I'm imagining like some of the shops that have a huge variety of fragrances, that some of them are more tropical themed. So I guess I can sort of understand why you would want to smell like a banana.
There is a small caveat. You don't actually want to smell like banana, partly because when bees get distressed, they release banana scent. It's just what their alarm pheromone smells like, kind of like banana. So if you do decide you want to smell like bananas, maybe not spend a lot of time around bees, but most of the time that bee is just investigating you. If it finds you particularly alarming, it will call other bees to help out. So if lots of bees are around you, maybe don't wear that perfume outside. But if it's just one or two, they're just curious for the most part. If you're allergic to bees, I wish I had better advice for how to put in a pollinator garden if you're allergic to bees. But the best advice I can give is plant plants that are going to be less likely to attract bees. Bees generally like bright colors, like bright yellow. They really like purples and blues. So lighter colored flowers or red colored flowers are more likely to attract moths and butterflies than they are bees. You can also avoid flat surfaces like daisies or coreopsis because they're more likely to attract bees than they are to attract butterflies. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, bright colors are really going to be the ones that attract bees.
Now, I would add to that most of us, if we have a yard, that there's usually a few spots that we don't use a lot and don't walk by frequently. So maybe people that have more of a concern could move their pollinator gardens into an area like that where they just go over there when they need to maintain it, and they can take note of what times of day the bees are more or less active and plan their time accordingly. And then they're able to maybe coexist a little bit easier with a variety of pollinators that might include some bees, even if they're focusing on the flowers that are more attractive to things like butterflies and hummingbirds and even ants and flies and things. So I think that there's a way that anybody can participate even when you do have valid concerns like that.
Great idea, moving the garden not to where it's not constantly around you. That's a great idea. And also wearing protective clothing while you're in the garden would be beneficial as well.
So before we wrap up, are there any other fun facts or key takeaways that you want our audience to experience and to hear about from you?
So a lot of people, when they first start gardening, they see things like aphids and mealybugs and all those quote-unquote pest insects and freak out. They're like, oh no, my plant's going to die. I have to get rid of all of them. And then they'll wholesale spray pesticides of various types and not realize that they are potentially making the issue worse instead of better.
Right.
The problems with pesticides is that, yes, they do, or they can, affect the insects that you're spraying for. Although keep in mind that those insects they may be resistant to the pesticide you're using, and you won't know until you try.
Yeah.
But they also affect other insects. There are very few pesticides that are insect-specific, so group-specific. Most insecticides, most pesticides are broad spectrum. They are meant to kill whatever insect they come in contact with. Pollinators that come in contact with them, they don't necessarily need to directly come in contact with the pesticide. So they don't have to be sprayed directly, but if residues are left behind, then that can potentially damage them. If the residues are on the leaves and something like an adorable little leaf cutter bee comes along, cuts a little circle out of it, puts it in her nest, then that can actually kill her offspring. But sometimes there's the overspray, as you mentioned earlier, and it gets on the ground. And if you have ground nesting bees, then that can actually damage them as well. It can damage the caterpillars that are feeding on the leaves. It can damage the little bees that are nesting in the stems.
Some of those things stay there for
Oh,
a
yes,
long
definitely.
period of time, and they can drift much farther than we realize because those like aerosol particle level
Right.
things that they travel in the air. And so maybe you're not using those particular pesticides, but the neighbors are using them in a manner that allows for that drift to come into your area. There's not really a way to completely avoid it until the culture around you starts to change. And we talked about in a previous episode, the label is the law, that if you're applying a fertilizer, a pesticide, an herbicide, any of these things, that you need to understand the label instructions very carefully so that you can use the science that they've put into that product to make sure that you're doing the least harm while you're accomplishing the goal that you need to accomplish. But from an integrated pest management standpoint, which we encourage, of can you just spray some of those aphids off with the water hose before you approach, like a pesticide that would then harm the aphids and other beneficial things that are actually helping you control them in the first place.
Right. So I encourage a low pest garden rather than no pest. Okay, so you've got some aphids. Spray them off with a water hose, like you said. Okay, so you've got some mealybugs. Squish them and spray them off with a hose. A low pest garden, not a no pest garden, makes a huge difference in what happens with your garden. And those beneficial insects are going to come to
Absolutely.
eat
And we
your
all love
aphids.
seeing the ladybugs, just like I love seeing the dragonflies, that I understand that dragonflies means I have mosquitoes. Ladybugs means maybe I have some aphids. And yet, if I can maintain a
Yep.
healthy balance, then I can have a much healthier garden and a healthier ecosystem overall.
And you're doing the thing that you put in the pollinator garden for, or
Right.
that pollinator pot, or that pollinator hanging basket. You're helping your pollinators rather than hurting them. So low pest is the easiest way to help your pollinators, but not and
Yeah.
decrease the chance of hurting them.
This has been amazing. And I have so much enjoyed getting to chat with you and just the knowledge that you're able to share and being able to geek out about insects and pollinators in general. And with this June episode celebrating Pollinator Month, we're just so delighted that you were able to join us. And I hope that we'll be able to chat with you again very soon.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I also love the opportunity to geek out about pollinators and talk about all the amazing things that they do for us and what we can do to help them.
Well, it was so great to have Dr. Joyce Fassbender on the show today talking about pollinators and what we can do in our gardens. But that really brings me back to the Ready, Set, Grow portion of our show that we always wrap up with. And as we're coming into the hopefully more rainy weather that we need so much to recover from this drought, and coming into the hotter months of our summer, some of the things that we need to be aware of as we're preparing our gardens and maintaining them in general is mosquito control. And this is definitely the season where they are going into full gear. And like we talked about in the show, we don't want to go for a pesticide right away. If there's some other appropriate ways that we can manage them that still support our ecosystem. And a lot of that is their breeding grounds, that we're making sure that we're not leaving still standing water that becomes stagnant where they can breed, and that there are trends about mosquito buckets where you can put the BT dunks into some water so that those larvae can then not emerge. And so then that disrupts their breeding cycle. And it's an approach that doesn't harm the dragonflies and the other things that we're trying to mitigate them, not remove them entirely. And things that you can do to attract fireflies, because we do have some fireflies in Florida. And again, that really starts with reducing or eliminating your use of pesticides in your garden and in the ground in particular, because many of them will nest or overwinter in the ground in leaf litter, keeping your lights off at night. We understand the turtle season at the beach that you need to use the very low amber kind of lights that don't disrupt their attraction to the lunar cycle, that insects and pollinators have a similar tendency, that they're like the moth on the light bulb, that they will be attracted to that unnatural source of light that then doesn't benefit them in the way that if they're using the moon to navigate or to find their food sources or anything else, that we need to be creating as natural as possible of a habitat for them. And that includes the lights that we have and the plants that we grow and the way that we care for our ground. So that's definitely something in preparing your garden for success, that you want to attract and support the beneficial wildlife. But then over the heat of the summer, there are not as many things that we would want to grow in our climate in Florida, that the heat and the humidity, that further north, you're used to cucumbers and tomatoes and all the things that now's the time to get them going. But for us, they're kind of wrapping up. And we want to shift more into some things like the tropical plants, the spinach, even some pigeon peas or sweet potatoes, things that can grow in the heat. The Seminole pumpkin is a nice native plant here that it's more of a winter squash kind of fruit that it produces, not as much of a true pumpkin flavor. I've heard it compared to an acorn squash. So something that you could easily use in cooking, but it grows well here. And a fun fact that I learned recently is that you want to let that grow on the ground versus a trellis, because it will continue putting down adventitious roots along the stems, and it's drawing that much more support and nutrient and even just moisture out of the ground at those points along the branches or the vines that then support the fruit that grows on it. So again, it's even a little late for okra in some of our heat and humid climate, but those are a few of the things that if you wanted to keep them going over the summer, you could potentially do. And keeping them sheltered, if you just have a container of herbs, maybe you can put it somewhere in the shade or even bring it into a screen porch or something that you're able to keep it going a little bit longer, where it won't just bolt and flower and set seed right away. Or you can look up the ones that the seeds are actually usable as well, where the seed is a spice and the leaf is an herb. And cilantro is one that comes to mind, where I've been able to harvest some coriander seeds off of it that then I can regrow. And I've grown some of them as microgreens. So there's definitely things that we can still be growing and planting right now, and highlighting a few of the flowers and things that would be able to support our pollinators over the summer. Anything that's in the amaranth family, you can grow that in the heat and year round, and that does provide some support for the pollinators. The gazania and gaillardia, there are some native varieties as well as some well-established or naturalized varieties that are very well suited to our area. Gomphrena and milkweed, and even the tropical sage that we talked about earlier in this episode, that those are all great sources of pollinators that will bloom in the heat, so that we are supporting with the food sources and just some pretty flowers that we can enjoy all year round. So I hope that this has been as exciting to you as it has been to me, because I definitely have learned and appreciated so much more that the ecosystem around us and our gardens are places of life, and that if we're doing it right, that we're going to see many kinds of life, not just the plants, but we're going to see the insects, and we're going to see the little creatures, the birds and the squirrels and other animals, that it all is beneficial. And those caterpillars that we see munching on the leaves are the butterflies that are going to continue that cycle of the flowers turning to seed and growing again. So as we're coming into these hot summer months, I just really hope that you still find a chance to get out into your garden and just keep making Pinellas this beautiful place that we love to live. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning into Planting Pinellas. We hope you're feeling inspired to get involved, learn more, and grow alongside this incredible community.
Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you like the show, leave us 5 stars or a review. And don't forget to share with fellow plant lovers. Until next time, keep planting, keep growing, and keep making Pinellas County a place to thrive.
This podcast is brought to you by the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences Extension in Pinellas County, Florida, an equal opportunity institution.